let's look at them a little more closely. And I find that there are 2 points that really help understand the interplay between IHL and humanitarian principles, who they're addressed to and what their sources are. So who are they addressed to? IHL principally to parties to an armed conflict, to states and to organized armed groups. Humanitarian principles to those wishing to carry out humanitarian action. This seems pretty evident, but it's often confused. Now, if we look at some of the instruments that Jeremy just mentioned, we're going to have confirmation of this. So, for example, the Proclamation of '65 sets out the fundamental principles on which Red Cross action is based, i.e. the action of the components of the movements, the ICRC, the Federation, and national societies. Similarly, within the United Nations context, General Assembly Resolution 46-182 lays down the framework for strengthening and coordinating emergency humanitarian assistance of the UN, states that humanitarian assistance must be provided in accordance with the principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality. So we have a resolution, a General Assembly resolution adopted by states, but it's not about how states must behave. It's about the behavior of those who want to provide humanitarian assistance. We're running a bit late. I had a number of examples of how the Security Council has addressed humanitarian principles. And it's interesting to see because, as is the case on a number of other issues, the Security Council is not consistent in the terminology it uses and often actually doesn't get things right in relation to humanitarian principles and calls upon state parties to comply with them. I won't go through them now, but perhaps we can go through them later. So, as I said, the principles are addressed to those who want to carry out humanitarian action. It's inaccurate and makes no sense to ask parties to an armed conflict to comply with humanitarian principles. They have to comply with their obligations under IHL in times of armed conflict. But it's not incumbent upon parties to an armed conflict to comply with the humanitarian principles. However, they must not prevent those carrying out humanitarian action from doing so in a principled manner. That's the role of parties to an armed conflict vis-à-vis the humanitarian principles. Don't prevent humanitarian actors from operating in a principled manner. Admittedly, some of the same values underlying humanitarian principles also underlie some of the obligations of parties to an armed conflict. And you'll have seen the words. I'm thinking in particular of humanity and non-discrimination. These are words, concepts that we find in international humanitarian law and also in human rights law and also in refugee law. But this doesn't mean that the parties to an armed conflict must comply with humanitarian principles. IHL is not the source of the principles. Rather, I think it's an indication of the importance of these values in times of armed conflict and how it is incumbent on a range of different actors to respect them in different ways. So it's for those carrying out humanitarian action who should comply with the principles for the operational reasons we discussed earlier, because it makes it more likely that they'll be allowed to operate in a manner that is safe and unimpeded. Why do I say should? Because the principles are not binding, or at least not binding per se. And why do I say per se? And this takes me to my second point, which is the source of the humanitarian principles. And all too frequently, there's an assumption that the source of the principles is international humanitarian law. And this is not correct. As Jeremy has just pointed out, as far as the components of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movements are concerned, the fundamental principles were proclaimed by the Red Cross Conference in '65. The components of the movement must comply with these principles as a matter of internal movement obligations. That's why they're binding of them and act in accordance with them. However, the conference itself is not the source of the principles. We actually had an interesting conversation as to why this proclamation, why this strange term, why didn't it just adopt the principles? It definitely laid down definitions of the principles that have been used since then by the movement and also beyond. But it wasn't the source of the principles. In fact, as Jeremy also pointed out, some of the fundamental principles were in fact already referred to in the Geneva Convention, so 49. So while the Geneva Conventions, the additional protocols, are not the source of the principles, they do refer to them. And at the moment, I'm an academic, I have time to do things like word searches, things that I'd love to do in my office job but can't. So I did a word search of the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols to see which of the fundamental principles came up. And neutrality comes up, but essentially in dealing with states that are not parties to the armed conflict. Independence does not come up at all, but it is humanity/humanitarian and impartial that are the principles that that also appear in IHL. And when do we see these terms? When IHL instruments identify particular tasks, particular activities that may be carried out by actors that operate in accordance with these principles. And for the most part, but not exclusively, they relate to relief operations. So just one example, Article 59 of the Fourth Geneva Convention on relief operations in situations of occupation states, and I'm paraphrasing, states that if the whole or part of the population of an occupied territory is inadequately supplied, the occupying power shall agree to relief schemes carried out by impartial humanitarian organizations. So that's where we have a reference in IHL to the principles. And there's a number of other ones, I won't go into them now, Article 70 of Additional Protocol 1, Article 18.2 of Additional Protocol 2, I'll come to these later, and Common Article 3, which is actually broader in nature because it foresees the possibility of offers of services more broadly, so assistance and protection being made by an impartial humanitarian body, such as the ICRC. So another reference in IHL to the principles. So if we go back, I have 2 minutes, 1 minute and a half. If we go back to my initial question, are they binding? What are the consequences of not complying with principles as a matter of law? Well, an actor that doesn't comply with the principles doesn't benefit from the provisions in question. And so here's one example. Article 70 of Additional Protocol 1 provides that if the civilian population is not adequately provided with certain essential supplies, relief actions that are humanitarian and